The sun over the high plains of Wyoming didn't just rise, it ignited, setting the vast, unforgiving sky ablaze with a fire that promised another day of relentless heat. For Eli McCade, watching it from his porch with a chipped mug of bitter coffee, the sunrise felt less like a promise and more like a threat. It was a spotlight on his failure. The land, which had been in his family for 4 generations, was dying a slow, dusty death, and he was the McCade who would preside over its final breath. Eli was a man carved from the same rugged stock as the land itself, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from rope and reins, and a face leathered by decades of sun and wind. But lately, a deeper weariness had settled into his bones, a hollow ache that no amount of hard work could fill. The drought, now in its 3rd brutal year, had cracked the earth into a desperate mosaic. His water holes were nothing but circles of baked mud, and the hayfields that should have been waist-high and emerald green were instead stretches of brittle, yellowed stubble. The bank's final notice, crisp and impersonal, lay folded in his shirt pocket, a constant, painful pressure over his heart. He had 30 days. 30 days before the legacy of McCade Ranch was auctioned off to the highest bidder. His gaze swept over the small herd of cattle he had left, their ribs showing, their heads hung low. He'd already sold off the majority, each trailer load of prime Angus feeling like a piece of his own soul being hauled away. These last 50 were the heart of his herd, the breeding stock his father had entrusted to him. Now, they were just another debt he couldn't pay. The crunch of tires on his long gravel driveway broke the morning's heavy silence. He didn't need to look to know it was Sarah. Her old, blue pickup truck, spattered with mud and dust, was as familiar a sight as the mountains on the horizon. Sarah was his neighbor, though neighbor in Wyoming meant a 20-minute drive across open range. She was a widow, a few years younger than his own 62, and she ran her smaller, more diverse spread with a quiet, stubborn competence that Eli had always admired. He watched her approach, a small, sturdy figure in worn jeans and a work shirt, her graying hair escaping from a loose braid. She carried a foil-covered plate, and the simple, homely sight of it made his throat tighten. In a world that was falling apart, Sarah's apple pies were a constant, a tiny anchor of normalcy. "Mornin', Eli," she called out, her voice warm and steady. She placed the pie on the porch railing. "Figured you could use a little something." "You didn't have to do that, Sarah," he said, his voice gravelly with unspoken emotion. "Thank you." She leaned against the railing, her keen eyes missing nothing. She saw the deep grooves of worry on his face, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of it all. "Heard from the bank?" she asked softly, no judgment in her tone, only concern. Eli just nodded, unable to form the words. He looked away, toward the barren fields, shame heating his neck. A McCade wasn't supposed to fail. His grandfather had fought off wolves and blizzards, his father had survived the farm crisis of the 80s. But Eli was being defeated by something as simple, and as monstrous, as a lack of rain. "What will you do?" Sarah pressed gently. "What can I do?" he snapped, the frustration boiling over. He immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, Sarah. It's just, there's no feed. The bank won't extend the loan. I've got no choice. I'll have to sell the rest of the herd next week. Then the land." The words tasted like ash. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze following his to the suffering cattle. "It's a damn shame," she whispered. Then, she turned to him, her expression shifting into something unreadable. "Eli, I want you to come over to my place." The request was so unexpected it took him a moment to process. "What? Now?" "Sarah, I've got a mountain of things to." "I know what you have to do," she interrupted, her voice firm now. "And this is more important. Please. Just come with me." Eli sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He didn't have the energy for whatever this was. But Sarah had been a good friend, a steadfast presence through the slow-motion catastrophe of the last few years. He owed her this small courtesy, even if his world was collapsing. "All right," he grumbled. Let me get my hat. The drive to her ranch was silent, the tension thick inside the cab of her truck. Eli stared out the window at the parched landscape, each familiar, dying landmark a fresh jab of pain. He wondered what she could possibly want to show him. A new irrigation system she'd installed. A patch of resilient grass she'd discovered. It was all too little, too late for his sprawling operation. When they pulled up to her homestead, things looked much the same as always. Tidy, well kept, but showing the same signs of strain as everywhere else. Her small garden was struggling, and the pond in the distance was shrunken. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. Nothing looked like a solution. She led him toward her main barn, a large, weathered structure that had always seemed too big for her modest herd of a dozen dairy cows and a few horses. As they approached the wide, closed doors, she stopped and turned to him. Her eyes, usually so calm and sure, were alight with a strange, nervous energy. "Eli," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Before we go in, I need you to understand something. What you're about to see, it wasn't done for thanks. It wasn't done for glory. It was just, done." Eli frowned, completely baffled. "Sarah, what in God's name are you talking about? What's in the barn?" A small, almost shy smile touched her lips. "Come inside first," she said, her hand resting on the heavy wooden latch. "Then you'll see." She pulled the door open just enough for them to slip through, into the dim, cool interior of the barn. The air, thick with the familiar, comforting smells of hay, dust, and livestock, hit him first. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, the world tilted on its axis. The barn was full. Not just with Sarah's few animals, but full. The spacious central aisle, usually empty, was now a bustling, organized hub of activity. And the stalls, every single one of the 24 stalls was occupied. But not by cows or horses. In the first stall, a young man with a prosthetic leg was carefully brushing a gleaming, dark bay mare. In the next, a woman, her face etched with the hollows of recent trauma, was gently feeding a handful of oats to an old, sway-backed gelding. Further down, a group of teenagers, their postures a mix of defiance and vulnerability, were mucking out stalls under the gentle guidance of an older man. There were veterans in faded military jackets, kids who looked like they'd been through the system, and older folks who carried a visible weight of loneliness. And the animals themselves, they weren't the prime, sleek creatures of his own ranch. They were rescues. A horse with a badly healed bowed tendon, a blind donkey, a sheep with 3 legs, a dog that lay quietly on a bed of hay, its body a map of old scars. It was a sanctuary, a hospital, a refuge for the broken and the discarded. Eli stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of the scene. This was Sarah's secret. A petting zoo. A hobby. How could this possibly help him with his catastrophic, real-world problems? Sarah was watching his face, and she must have seen the confusion and the flicker of disappointment there. "This is the second chance," she said softly, gesturing around the barn. "It's been my real work for the past 5 years. These people, they come here from all over the state. Some are referred by therapists, some by shelters, some just hear about it through the grapevine. They work with the animals. They care for creatures who have been hurt, just like they have. And in helping them heal, they heal themselves." It was a beautiful sentiment, Eli thought, a noble cause. But it had nothing to do with him. His heart, already a stone in his chest, sank further. He'd driven over here, hoping for a miracle, and found a charity project. "Sarah," he began, his voice strained with the effort to be polite. It's a fine thing you're doing here. Truly. But I don't understand what this has to do with me. I have 500 tons of hay to find and 50 head of cattle that are starving. I appreciate the thought, but I really need to get back." He turned to leave, the crushing weight of his own reality descending upon him once more. "Eli, wait," Sarah said, her voice cutting through his despair. She walked The silence in the barn was profound, broken only by the soft shuffling of hooves and the distant, hopeful cry of a meadowlark outside. Eli McCade stood amidst the proof of a miracle, and the weight of it finally buckled his knees. He didn't collapse, but he swayed, bracing a hand against a rough-hewn wooden post. The tears he had fought for so long now streamed freely down his leathery cheeks, carving clean paths through the dust of a dying season. He made no move to wipe them away. They were not tears of sadness, but of a soul-deep shock and a gratitude so immense it was physically painful. Sarah stood beside him, giving him the space to feel it all. She didn't try to comfort him with words. Her actions had already spoken volumes louder than any platitude ever could. She simply waited, a steady presence in the whirlwind of his emotions. All these people, Eli finally rasped, his voice thick and broken. Strangers. Why? Maria, the woman with the haunted eyes, took a small step forward. She was holding the three-legged sheep now, cradling it like a baby. Because a world where a place like this can be lost, she said, her voice surprisingly strong, is a world that becomes a little darker for everyone. My son, he comes here. It's the only place he smiles. You protect the light, Mr. McCade, wherever you find it. Leo, the veteran, limped over. My granddad was a rancher. Lost his place in the 80s. Nobody was there to throw him a rope. He gestured around the barn. This is the rope we wish he'd had. One by one, they shared their fragments of reason. A teenager named Jake said he'd grown up hearing stories about McCade Ranch from his grandfather. An older couple, the Wilsons, who had driven down from Sheridan with a pickup truck full of oats, simply said, "It's what you do." It was the most powerful lesson of Eli's life. For 62 years, he had believed strength was about self-reliance, about weathering the storm alone, chin up and shoulders squared. He had viewed the bank's notice as a personal indictment of his strength. Now, he saw that true strength wasn't in refusing to fall, it was in having the courage to accept the hands reaching out to break your fall, and the grace to be thankful for them. He turned to Sarah, his vision still blurred. The bank, the notice, this saves the herd, but the loan. Sarah's smile widened. Come with me, she said, a new glint in her eye. She led him out of the barn and back toward her farmhouse. Eli followed, feeling like a man in a dream. The harsh sunlight no longer felt accusatory, it felt clarifying. The world looked the same, parched and desperate, but he was seeing it through new eyes. Inside her cozy, sunlit kitchen, she poured them both a glass of iced tea and then went to an old roll-top desk. She pulled out a simple, leather-bound ledger. Sit down, Eli. He sat, his large frame making the wooden chair creak. Sarah opened the ledger and slid it across the table to him. It wasn't a record of her finances. It was a list. Page after page of names, addresses, and amounts. But they weren't amounts of money. Henderson, Ben, Laramie, 10 bales alfalfa. Delivered August 14th. St. Mary's Congregation, Sheridan, $500, for fuel/transport. Johnson Teens, volunteer labor, 16 hours, equivalent, 4 bales. It went on and on. Hundreds of entries. A vast, decentralized, grassroots army of salvation. I don't understand, Eli whispered, tracing a name with a trembling finger. It's a fortune. But it's not cash. Turn to the last page, Sarah instructed gently. He did. Taped to the inside back cover was a cashier's check. His eyes scanned the amount, and for the second time that morning, the breath was stolen from his lungs. It was enough. Not just to make a payment, but to pay off the entire outstanding loan balance for the year, with enough left over to drill a new, deeper well. How, he gasped, looking from the check to Sarah's serene face. That, she said, her own eyes growing moist now, is from the sale of my 40 acres on the south boundary to the Wind Farm Company. Eli shot to his feet, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. No. Sarah, You can't. That's your retirement. That's the best grazing land you have. It was, she corrected him softly. And now, it's the future of McCade Ranch. It was just land, Eli. Dirt and grass. This, she said, tapping the ledger, then placing her hand over her heart, this is what matters. This is community. This is family. You're my family, Eli. You have been for 30 years. You just never let yourself see it. The final piece of his defenses crumbled. He had been so alone, so entrenched in his solitary battle, that he had failed to see the army mustering at his gates. He had mistaken Sarah's quiet friendship for pity, when it was, and always had been, love. The love of a neighbor, the love of a friend, the love of one human being for another. He didn't know how long he stood there, weeping in Sarah's kitchen. He wept for the loss he had feared, for the gift he had been given, and for the profound foolishness of believing he had to carry his burdens alone. When the storm of emotion finally passed, he felt lighter than he had in years, cleansed and reborn. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, but it was a whirlwind of hope. The news of the Great Hay Gathering, as it came to be known, spread across the county, becoming a modern-day folktale. Trucks continued to arrive at McCade Ranch, but now Eli was there to greet them, to shake every hand, to learn every name. He worked alongside the volunteers from the Second Chance, who now came to his ranch to help distribute the feed and care for the rapidly improving cattle. The change on the ranch was palpable. The cattle, their bellies full of the miraculous hay, began to fatten, and their lowing was no longer a sound of distress, but of contentment. But the greater change was in Eli. The stoic, hardened rancher was gone, replaced by a man with a ready smile and an open heart. He started hosting weekly barbecues, inviting everyone who had helped, along with their families. His ranch, once a place of solitary struggle, became a hub of laughter and shared purpose. He used part of the money from Sarah's check to drill the new well. The day they struck water, a deep, cold, abundant aquifer, was a day of celebration that rivaled any 4th of July. But Eli knew the real water, the water that had saved him, had come from the wellspring of human compassion. He also instituted a new policy on McCade Ranch. He dedicated 100 acres to grow hay not for profit, but for a community emergency fund. Any rancher or farmer in the region hit by disaster, fire, drought, illness, would have a reserve to draw from. No questions asked. No repayment expected. He called it the Second Chance Fund, in honor of Sarah. One evening, several months later, Eli stood on his porch with Sarah, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. The land was still scarred from the drought, but green shoots were pushing through the cracked earth. The air was filled with the sounds of healthy cattle and the distant laughter of volunteers finishing their day's work. You know, Eli said, his voice quiet and full of wonder, I spent my whole life trying to be strong enough to deserve this land. I thought it was about endurance. About grit. Sarah slipped her hand into his, their calloused fingers lacing together. And what is it about, Eli? He looked out at the thriving ranch, at the new wellhead, at the barn that now stored hope as well as hay. He looked at the woman beside him, who had seen his breaking point and responded not with distance, but with an impossible, breathtaking act of love. It's about connection, Sarah, he said, his voice firm and sure. It's about realizing that the greatest strength we have isn't inside these fences. It's in the hearts of the people outside them. My grandfather fought off wolves, my father fought off bankruptcy, but I was saved by kindness. And I reckon that's a battle worth fighting every single day. The last of the sun's rays dipped below the horizon, but for the first time in a long, long time, Eli McCade felt no fear of the coming dark. He was no longer just a rancher guarding his land, he was a keeper of the flame, a node in a vast and powerful network of human goodness. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that as long as that flame was tended, no drought, no debt, and no despair could ever truly win. The harvest of hope had begun, and it was more abundant than any crop he had ever known.